We're joined now by Senator Roy Blunt, Republican Missouri, talking about a lot of things here today, including, of course, the budget and guns and sequester and immigration. Senator Blunt, how are you this morning?
I'm good, Greg. How are you?
Doing really well. We're glad to have you back. Let's start with the gun control thing, because you guys are starting to debate that today. And there's three main things that I understand are in the main bill, and then there's going to be all kinds of amendments. One is this idea of expanding the background checks to close what some call the gun show loophole, which was really just an exemption for private purchases. For people that don't know, if you were buying from a federal licensed dealer, you had the background check. If you bought from somebody who wasn't a licensed dealer, whether it was at their home or online or at a gun show, you didn't have that background check. So they're trying to say you're going to have to do that at the gun shows. Now, Senator Blunt, I understand that we've got this deal coming from Senator Manchin and Senator Toomey, but we really don't have the details of this. What exactly does their amendment do?
Well, I don't have all the details on their amendment either, Greg. I do know that the NRA has some problems with their amendment. I don't think their amendment would pass the House if it did pass the Senate. I think the real unfortunate thing here is that the administration is so eager to talk about guns that they've come up with a solution that wouldn't have prevented any of the tragedies that we all hate having happen in the country and to these families involved. But there's not a single thing anybody's proposed that would have stopped what happened in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, or in Tucson, Arizona, or in Aurora, Colorado. Not a single thing. I've thought all the time that the real opportunity here was to look at the way we deal with mental health issues in the country and do something about that, because whether it's a knife on a college campus this week or guns in any of those places I mentioned, the one thing that is absolutely consistent is that whoever did that had a significant mental health problem, and a tragedy resulted because of that. So I think it's unfortunate that we're stuck on a solution that doesn't solve the problem, and we're looking beyond what everybody understands is one of the real elements here that we might have been able to do something about.
I think it's a great point, Senator Blunt, and it really kind of brings up a question of, are they really doing this because of Sandy Hook, or are they using Sandy Hook's tragedy as an opportunity to put through things that they wanted before? Because, as you mentioned, none of this would have stopped Sandy Hook or any of the recent mass shootings that we have had. And if you really want to talk about the big homicide problem with guns, it's handguns, and the majority of those killings are done in certain zip codes in our country that happen to mainly be inner cities. And if you bring that up somehow, that's a ridiculous thing to talk about. That's where most of the gun homicides are, and this won't stop that either.
Well, that's right. That's right. And, of course, that's not something we should say we can't do anything about. We ought to figure out how we work with law enforcement and drugs and gang violence and things that create those kinds of killings. And then you've got the other kinds of killings that are just somebody that's mentally unbalanced that does incredibly tragic things that make us afraid to send our kids to the movie theater or even to school or to the grocery store. We ought to be trying to figure out how to do something about that. Right. And some of these proposals do that.
Senator Blunt, let me ask you on that, because even let's go to what was the guy? I think it was the one in Colorado. He had gone to his counselor in college, and that psychiatrist said, this guy is having homicidal thoughts, right? So they pulled his card from campus that let him into some buildings. He actually told the campus police about it. They did nothing. However, it wasn't enough where this psychiatrist thought that he needed to be involuntarily put in a mental health facility. So where is the line drawn on where you would say, Senator Blunt, that this person shouldn't have a gun? Because what if somebody's depressed, they get on antidepressants, and they go see a psychiatrist, but then they're starting to feel better, they're off the antidepressants. Does that mean that person needs to give up their guns? I mean, people are wondering, where does the line go on that?
Well, that's true, Greg. And, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. psychologist. I'm not sure I can know where to draw that line, but I do know that the way we've treated mental health, the way the federal government has encouraged states to get people out of mental hospitals when they were in mental hospitals. You know, the federal government will pay you half of the so-called community cost if states will send somebody out of a mental health facility, because it's the federal government's paying probably the Medicaid rate there, and we've just not dealt with those problems in the right way. Access to that information, I think, should very much be available to other law enforcement people in the community. You mentioned Aurora, Colorado, the guy in Tucson, as I recall, that shot several people, including Congressman Giffords, at the supermarket. He had been banned from the community college, but none of that information was shared with the local law enforcement people. We've got to do a better job of identifying these. You know, in our state, we've been a leader in something called mental health first aid, where teachers and others who are dealing with kids get a 1-day, 2-day, 3-day course that doesn't make them a psychologist, but does help them figure out if somebody in their class, somebody in their Boy Scout troop, somebody they're seeing that they associate with has the kind of problems that at least are the kind of problems you ought to say, we ought to talk to somebody else about whether they should see someone who does know what they're doing in dealing with mental health problems. There are a lot of things you can do, but for whatever reason, the administration and frankly the national media, I know there have been a couple of national media discussions in newsrooms where they've said, you know, this is a mental health problem too, and the decision is, well, that's not really the story we want to cover here. We want to cover the story about guns, right, whether it solves the problem or not. Sure. At the end of the day.
And then they leave out how many times guns are used to actually prevent crimes, 5 times more often than commit crimes, and they leave out all the positives that go along with that. You know, you mentioned also going after gun crimes, and part of this bill that you guys are debating would toughen laws against gun trafficking and straw purchases, but prosecution of our current federal gun laws and gun crimes is down 40% under this administration from George W. Bush's administration. What good does putting more laws in do if we're not going to follow through on the ones we have?
Well, you know, there's almost a famous contact and conflict between Lindsey Graham and a police chief in one of these hearings recently, where the police chief just says, we don't have time to follow up on paperwork. And that was the point Lindsey Graham was trying to make, is that all of the people that aren't allowed to get guns now, and suddenly you know where they are and who they are and where they're trying to get a gun on a gun check, often nobody does anything about it. So how much more information do you need when you don't follow up on the information you have?
Good question. Real quick on this. Where do you stand on the background check? Would you vote up or down on that amendment?
You know, I haven't looked at it totally yet, but I'd like to find things to vote for that solve the problem rather than things that just act like we've done something we haven't done. I'm a big supporter of the Second Amendment. And I'm not going to do anything that weakens the Second Amendment. And I'm going to look at all of these pretty carefully, like, the thing you mentioned that is in the bill on straw purchases and somebody buying a gun to give it to a criminal. Obviously, that sounds like it's something we'd want to prevent, but does this language really prevent it? School safety? I'm totally for school safety, but what does Barbara Boxer's school safety section of the bill say by the time it gets to the floor?
Right.
So I'm going to look at all of it, but I've sworn to uphold the Constitution. That includes the First Amendment and the Second Amendment and all of the amendments, and I intend to be doing that.
Right, so it sounds like you're against this unless they can convince you that they're doing things that wouldn't violate the Second Amendment, obviously. So right now you're pretty much a no unless they can convince you of something, right? Is that fair to say?
I'm for not solving. I think that's fair to say. Okay. I'm not for acting like we've solved a problem that everybody knows we haven't solved.
All right, let's get to the sequester a little bit, because it's gotten ridiculous on how many things that the media, thankfully, a lot of conservative media and some mainstream media now pointing out some of the nonsense that we're still spending money on during the sequester while we claim we can't save any money. Things like the plasticity of a duck penis. Really, we're spending money on that, So we're saying, are you kidding me? So you're looking into... They're telling us that the only thing we can cut in the agriculture department is to take out some of these meat inspectors. And you're saying, wait a second, there's something else here. What can we do?
Well, as you know, I was able to get all of those meat inspectors to where they show up between now and the end of September. And we got 40,000 people in our state that couldn't work any day the meat inspector's not there. And whether it's an egg facility or a poultry facility or a meat facility, the USDA inspector has to be there. That's for those people not to work at those really hard jobs because somebody couldn't show up. And I've got another piece of legislation I tried to get on this last appropriations bill where anybody that has to show up on a day when the weather's bad or a day when under President Clinton and President Obama both, they said these people will show up if there's a government shutdown. Those people should have to show up no matter what. The food safety inspector, the air traffic controller, the border security guard. It's not a big list, but it's a list that if you have to show up if there's no money to run the government, and you've been defined by President Clinton and President Obama both in writing as you need to show up if there's a government shutdown, you should be the people showing up.
Yeah.
If there's a 2.5% cut in government spending.
Especially when you see all these places that we can save. And really, as far as that legislation, as I've read through it, there's nothing in there preventing the administration of each one of these departments of finding places they can cut beyond instantly going to furloughing required essential employees. Look at the FAA thing here. 27% decrease in flights since 2001, but somewhere between a 41 to 50% increase in their budget since 2001. And yet they're saying with a 4% cut, the only thing they can do is close towers and get rid of TSA guys on furlough. Are you kidding?
Well, I think I think the administration clearly wants any time that there's a reduction in spending. And by the way, the bill we passed the other day gets discretionary spending back to the 2008 level, which is a huge accomplishment that nobody's talked much about because the administration wants it to be painful anytime you cut any spending anywhere. So let's close the White House. Let's make the lines at the airport as long as we can. Let's say that the kids aren't going to get vaccines. A lot of that they've had to back off from, and clearly they overplayed their hand. And by the way, Greg, there doesn't have to be a sequester at all if the House and the Senate and the President will just agree on spending bills that don't add up to more than the law now says we can spend in a given year. I think the Budget Control Act is a good thing. It's going to save us over $1 trillion in 10 years. I am not for repealing it. I think that you don't have to have the sequester, but if that's the only way the President will countenance saving this money, it's better to cut spending that way than not to cut spending at all.
Gotcha. Hey, we appreciate the time. We know you got to run. We'll have you back on again soon.
Great to talk to you. See you soon.
All the best.